Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end-user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. Here we are, Scott, another episode. How are you today?
Oh, I'm just peachy, man. I'm ready for summer to be over and kids to be out of the house and all that fun stuff. But thankfully, they have a short summer this year.
Yeah, at least you didn't say you were ready for a 3-day weekend since we just got over the 4th of July sort of weekend. That was just a bizarre holiday with it being on Tuesday.
Yeah, between neighbors trying to burn my house down and people getting shot in Jacksonville, it's just been a weird couple days over here at the beach.
All right, so enough about Jacksonville and weird. How about Office deployments and weird and release channels and first release and fast ring and slow ring and select users and tenants? You want to dive into Office 365 updates, how they roll those out, maybe talk about some of the Pro Plus and those updates as well?
Yeah. So which side do you want to start on? Office 365 or Office on the desktop?
Flip a coin and pick.
Let's start out with Office 365. That seems to be one that's confusing people lately, especially with the way some of the stuff's been coming. So what we're really talking about is release cycles, or kind of how Microsoft goes through and flights new features or functionality and determines what's released out to the world. So in Office 365 land, really we're talking about the web side of things, right? That suite of web services that we entitle our users for. You've effectively got 3 deployment channels for things and kind of how they come about. So you have what's known as first release, which you can enable for your entire tenant. So as Microsoft flights new features, let's take Forms as an example. Forms for commercial tenants comes out and they say, hey, to use this brand new feature, which isn't available to everybody else, but it's going to be available soon, you're going to need to go ahead and turn on first release for your entire tenant. So once you've done that, you'll start to get access to some of those pre-release, pre-announced features before they hit general availability. So they're kind of beta-ish, and eventually they'll come to GA. And then on the other side, there's a thing called first release for select users. So in some cases, new features and functionality are flighted through that channel as well. Let's take communication sites as an example of that. So you can't have the entire organization in first release. This probably makes sense if you run a production, quote unquote, production tenant up in Office 365 and you don't want to have or pay for the expense of having a dev tenant. You can designate certain users to say, as features that support this functionality of first release for select users are pushed out to the world, I would like user A, user B, and user C to go ahead and participate in that program and have access to those kinds of things. Typically, a lot of those features, when they come out, again, we'll look at like communication sites. So once one user is in first release for select and they have access to that feature, they can go ahead and do something like create a communication site and then share it with users who potentially don't have access to first release for select users. So those are kind of your 2 options within first release land. And then your third option in Office 365 is just wait for everything to come out like everybody else does. So you want to be kind of quote unquote stable and wait until Microsoft says everything's ready for consumption in the real world. You don't have to put anybody into first release for your entire tenant or any users in there.
So what you're really telling me when it comes to first release is that there's no way to guarantee my tenant's always going to get stuff first, because if you choose to do your entire tenant or if you choose to do select users, it's in either or. It's your typical radio buttons. You either do select users or you do your entire tenant. So in the case of like Forms and communication sites, there's no way for me to make sure I get both of those at the same time. I have to kind of pick which first release I want to use. Kind of like you said, whether it's production or test, it may vary. And then I just kind of have to wait to get those features based on how they're released.
That's 100% correct. So it all depends on the product group that's pushing the feature and how they choose to push it out to the world. So in the majority of cases, quite often lots of the things I've seen or that I can remember over, since first release came about, because they didn't always have first release for select users. It used to be first release just for your tenant. So for the longest time, it was just everything came out to first release for tenant and then maybe first release for users and then straight to GA. But quite often it was first release for tenant, straight to GA. There were very few things that came out specifically to first release for users, for select users. And really the guidance was you really weren't going to have access to most of the things in first release for select users just because stuff isn't developed that way on the back end. It's not made to be pushed that way. So now it's starting to get interesting that they're actually leveraging these features and doing them more and more. They don't really align too well, and the story is not great around it. And apparently it's one of those things that's not well documented. Well, it's documented enough, but it's not grokkable if you don't do Office 365 and understand the way Microsoft's been pushing these updates for years and years and years now.
Yeah, it would be nice if they kind of standardized around them and almost treated, I saw something on Twitter the other day, almost treated that select users like a fast string, where you could guarantee that everything's always going to come to select users first. And then from select users, it goes to the tenant. And then from the tenant, it goes to everybody, that normal release cycle. Who knows? Maybe one day they'll standardize around how those features get released.
Yeah, some of the folks in some of those threads, one of them was a product manager on the Office 365 side, and they understand that there's lack of understanding about, the way this is all set up. They also understand it's not always clearly communicated how these updates are pushed out to the world and what happens there along the way. They came back and said, we're looking to align it and see what we can do. So kind of the typical Microsoft stuff. So maybe they'll get there. Depending on, like I said, where you sit and what you do. Personally, I don't see much value in first release for your entire tenant if you run a production tenant and you're doing a commercial business, or you're not a partner or an ISV or a consultancy or something like that. So if you've got 1,000 consultants running around and they all do Microsoft consulting and they need to know what's coming in Office 365, first release might make sense for your tenant. But if you've got, 50 people that all do billing for your organization and it's like a must-have that they got to be up and running, first release for your tenant's not an option. And that's where first release for select users kind of becomes a sweet spot, because you can say, well, for some of you, sometimes potentially you'll have access to these new things.
Yeah, I agree. I'm one of those consultancies. I like living on the edge. So I have first release on for my whole tenant. But yeah, totally what you said. My clients, I'm like, don't turn first release on for your tenant. Just do a few select users, make it easier. One other thing that's kind of goofy in all of this too is I think SharePoint is the only product within the suite that does it. But we talked about those release schedules. This isn't technically a release, but you also have that option within SharePoint Online to actually enable and disable preview features, which is, again, kind of giving you some early access to some stuff that is kind of rolling out, not fully baked in yet. Something else to be aware of, because I know that'll hit people too, like some of the modern UI sites. There's some various features within specifically SharePoint Online that they roll out, and you get if you have that enable preview features on, and that could also hit your end users where you may not want them necessarily dealing with some of these preview features that are still being tested in SharePoint Online.
Yes. And I think that's where some of that confusion came in when they started talking about first release for select users and things in the way back when. Again, all the products are controlled by different teams on the back end, and they don't always talk to each other. So the guys who are writing Skype aren't talking to the folks who are over and working on SharePoint, day to day. They're not meeting together. And they're also not meeting with the platform folks on the top end to say, hey, here's how we're going to allow you to effectively do like beta testing of features across the platform. So in some cases, SharePoint teams went out and built their own stuff, right? Because they just were there, and that's the way they wanted to get it done. I think over time, folks just need to recognize that these features are there and take a serious look at them and figure out what makes sense for your organization and kind of what level you're ready to bite off. There are trade-offs, right? So, again, we'll go, I want to have forums and communication sites. Sorry, you can't. You got to pick one. Which one's most important to you? And what's the operational impact down the road to everybody else that participates in your tenant?
Yep. And again, they'll still come to that first release. It might just be in different schedules. So don't freak out and think that Forms is going to go from first release to select users to general availability, or conversely, that communication sites is going to go from select. I think I said that backwards, but you get the picture. It's not going to go from one of those directly to standard release. It's still going to hit both groups of first release users before it goes GA. The timeline might just shift on when you actually get those in your tenant.
At least we hope that's the way it works.
Okay, good caveat there. So a couple more things before, if you have first release turned on, can you back it out? How difficult is it to back out if you do realize, hey, we have first release on for a tenant, we want to go to select users? What's the experience if you do go in and back off or turn off that first release?
You flip a switch, one of those radio buttons you said, and you do your ritual sacrifice and donate some money someplace and do a good deed, and you hope it all goes well.
And pray that none of your users are using first release features that you're not aware of.
Well, that's the rub. You would never really know. I haven't had too much trouble flipping, in the past in smaller tenants for just like dev test scenarios, going through and flipping between like first release and first release for select. To be honest, I've never had to do it on a wide scale. I'm not sure what would happen if you had, an organization with a couple hundred folks already testing forms and you went ahead and turned that feature off. Why don't you go find a client and make that happen?
All right, let me just go find a client, just flip it off and see what they do. Yeah, my understanding is that, again, I haven't actually flipped it off on a huge tenant yet either, where you don't necessarily know if somebody's using forms or not. But my understanding of it, just based on everything I've seen, everything I've read, smaller scenarios, is that all of a sudden everybody just kind of loses access to whatever they may have been working on, whatever first release features they may have been using. They're just gone. Maybe the URL to the form that's been created will still work. I don't really know, but they definitely won't be able to go out and create any new forms.
Maybe somebody out there will tell us how it's actually supposed to work, since that is definitely not documented that I'm aware of.
Yeah. And then as these new features come, is there any way you can, try to stay up to date on some of these features? I know I've looked at the Office 365 roadmap. We can put a link to that in the show notes. From my perspective, that's kind of hit or miss on how frequently it's updated and if it's up to date. I tend to go more by the Message Center Office 365 to find out about first release, what's coming, what's not. Any other insights there from your side of the...
I think you nailed it. So Message Center is probably the most important one. So within your tenant, your Message Center is different than my Message Center. So it's actually talking about features and functionality that are unique to you versus unique to me. So you might see an announcement there that I don't see in mine. So that's a great place to go and get into some of that stuff. There's also a bunch of tech community blogs and areas that you can follow around. More specifically, I'd recommend following People if you're going to go into the tech community and see what they're authoring. So there's a lot of the product marketing managers. So take like SharePoint, for instance. You've got Mark Cashman out there doing a bunch of stuff. If you look at things like Power Apps and Flow, or even like ECM within SharePoint, you've got Chris McNulty goes out and writes a bunch in there. If you're interested in Yammer and groups and things that are going on there, Miss Moneypenny is great to go out and be one of those users that you follow and see what they're writing about, because they're telling you about that stuff. And quite often the things that they write there are things that make it into the official blog posts later on like blogs.office.com, things like that. Twitter is also great. Again, follow the same people and see what's going on. Maybe create yourself a list and see what's happening there. If you are in a position where you want to know about these things and how they're coming out, you have to be willing to put some time in every day to kind of read about them. So you should definitely be going through your Message Center every day. I'd recommend following a couple RSS feeds for those folks out of the tech community, or like a Twitter list or something like that. Just something you can go through, consume really quick, and figure out what's happening and where things are at. And for the most part, Microsoft is getting better about explaining, where you need to be to make these things happen. So like in that blog post for ComSites, they did very explicitly say, hey, you got to be in this first release for select thing and not first release. And for some reason, that still confused everybody. There's a bunch of different places you can go. You're going to have to find what works for you.
Yeah, maybe we'll do an episode and we can go back and forth on some of our favorites. But you did forget the most important one to stay up to date, Scott. You forgot to tell people just to keep listening to our podcast.
Well, I thought that was implied.
Find it all out here. And tell other people to listen to it. If other people ask you where to go, you find out stuff, just tell them to come listen to our podcast. We'll cover it all.
There you go. Got it all figured out now.
So one other part of news that's kind of completely unrelated to Office 365 products is we got our first sponsor of our podcast.
Sweet.
Yeah. So we're going to take a brief pause here, 30-second clip from BitWizards, just to hear what they're all about. And again, a big thank you to them for sponsoring our podcast, helping us cover some of the cost. And after this message from them, we'll jump into Office 365 Pro Plus updates.
You love technology, so do we. You're an experienced IT pro. We respect that. You're a problem solver. We've got clients. You need a tan. We've got a beach. You love Azure. We love Azure. At BitWizards, we've won Florida Trend Magazine's Best Companies to Work For 8 years running and have been a Microsoft Gold partner since 2001. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like we were meant for each other. Go to bitwizards.com/cloudsmith to introduce yourself.
All right, Scott, here we are. We're back. We already covered Office 365 updates, the update channels. How about the Pro Plus? Installations, update channels. How does that desktop version of Office work when it comes to deployment channels and updates?
Awesome. So we kind of talked about the web side of the house, or really that web suite of services. So on the desktop side, you also have access in a lot of SKUs or your SKU packs to Office Pro Plus. So in today's world, that would be Office Pro Plus 2016. And on the desktop side, so let's primarily talk Windows first, since that's where we can make a lot of the customizations and do a bunch of this stuff in a kind of declarative way. You have basically current channels. So let's go ahead and keep me current kind of month to month. I want functional updates, security updates, things like that. You can also do a deferred channel. So let me go back into my deployment channel, and I don't want to run the most current functional updates, but I still want to get monthly security updates. So those run, I believe, quarterly now. So about every 3 months or so, you'll get a new drop in deferred channel. And then if you're going, you know what, I don't want to be current, I don't want to be a little bit behind, I'd like to be a little bit faster. There's also an Insider program for Microsoft Office. Insider includes a slow ring and a fast ring. So you can kind of pick your cadence of what you want in there. Do I want to be really broken or only semi-broken most of the time? And then there's also an Insider Fast Corporate, just to keep things super confusing.
Yeah, you go out and try to figure them all out, and it can get confusing. And then Microsoft has recently also decided they're going to try to rename these to make them less confusing, at least from that corporate update side. So you had mentioned like the standard channel, standard release is now going to be called the monthly channel. So it does help a little bit. Monthly channel, you get updates monthly. And then that fast release deferred is now going to be that semi-annual channel pilot. So it is going to be semi-annual now instead of the quarterly, like you said, every 3 or 4 months. It's going to be twice a year. So March and September, you'll get that pilot channel for the semi-annual /deferred. And then they have the semi-annual broad. So this is the new normal deferred, where you, again, get twice a year updates. And it looks like they're probably going to be about 3 months behind that deferred pilot. So there's a blog post that went out just recently that has some of these naming changes. Well, recently being back in April 20th, it looks like. Sometime over the course of the last couple months, they've kind of announced some of these changes, what it's going to be. So we'll link to that as well. But like we said, those are the names right now. It looks like they're all going to be changing September of this year. So you have a couple months to get used to the new names?
Yeah, if you are an IT pro from Windows land and you're used to Windows release schedules, so monthly we have Patch Tuesday. Windows 10 is now on a twice-a-year release cycle. Even Windows Server is starting to go that way, right? So if you're used to things from that side of the house, basically what's happening is Office updates are going to align to all of that as well. So there's not going to be the whole weird cadence of, well, I was over here with a Windows update and then I had these 2 Office updates this month and I don't know what's going on and where I'm at and what's happening. It's going to be all in one now and everything's going to follow the same cadence. And it's also going to drive product teams to make announcements kind of at the same time, right? So in the fall, there's the Windows 10 Creators update coming out, and now it's going to be, well, in the fall, we'll also know what features and functionality are going onto that roadmap because it'll be better documented to come out in that big bang release.
Yep. And it looks like all of this is probably going to tie in very closely with Ignite. So we'll have to keep an eye out during Ignite. Maybe we'll do some extra podcasts that week to keep you updated on all the news coming out of Ignite.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they'll have some good stuff out of there. Outside of having all these channels and kind of deployment mechanisms, you want to talk about a little bit about how we can customize that and actually get some of that stuff ramped up and going?
Sure. So like we said, we have all these channels. You may want to turn them on, turn them off for different people. There's a few different ways you can kind of configure the installation, set some of these updates to go, even control some of these updates yourself outside of relying on Microsoft's release schedule to just push them out to your users. So with the Pro Plus model for Office 365 for the desktop, they came out with this Office Deployment Tool, or ODT, and there's 2 versions of it. There's one if you want to do Office 2013, one if you want to do Office 2016. But essentially what this allows you to do is customize your installation and what products are included, what languages are included, much like the Office, I think it was the Office Customization Tool, or OCT, used to do for the MSI volume licenses. So you can go out, create this XML file that essentially defines how Pro Plus gets installed, and then you can push it out to your users. And this lets you even set like a network location. So if you want to create your own channels of releases, you can create different install packages, point to different locations for the install. And when a user goes into Office, it'll automatically update from the network location defined for that install. So you can, again, set up your own release schedules. Maybe you want to deploy an update to IT before you deploy it to the rest of the organization. So you point them at 2 different locations on your network to do the update. So that's one of the things you can do with the Office Deployment Tool. And then it's on you to actually go out and download these Pro Plus updates from Microsoft and drop them into these locations on your network when you want to do the update. So again, they actually give you a lot of control around how you do updates, when you want to do updates, how you want to customize the install for this Pro Plus. The other way is you can just allow users to install it themselves, rely on Microsoft to do the updates, and then set what channel you want to be in right in the GUI within your Office 365 administration. So you can go into Office 365 admin, go into the settings, look at those software settings and choose what channel your updates are going to be on, whether it's that deferred channel, the standard release, and I think you can select the first release deferred channel in there. And in that case, when users want Office 365 Pro Plus, they go to their browser, go out to their software downloads, download Office, install it themselves. And then in this case, you don't have that customization around where their updates are going to come from when they first install it. They're just going to pull them down from Microsoft. Microsoft pushes an update out. They'll automatically update. So there's, again, 2 different ways you can control it. You have some limited control if you just do it in the admin center in Office 365 in the GUI. If you want a lot more control, go look at this Office Deployment Tool, what options you have there. And you can really define, again, where those updates come from, what's included in the installs, and get a lot more fine-grained control over your Office installation on your client desktops.
Yeah.
We could spend a lot of time diving into the details.
ODT has become kind of interesting. So you mentioned that there's ODT for Office 2013 and Office 2016. I would just caution everyone that you should pretend that the ODT for Office 2013 doesn't exist, because you shouldn't be installing Office 2013 anymore, right? That gets no more updates. It's dead, dead, dead. Please, please, please deploy Office 2016 and great things will come your way. That's kind of one of the things there. Some of the other things you mentioned. So you can have your cake and eat it too in a lot of these scenarios. So being able to do something like ODT, you can go ahead and push an initial package. So go ahead and put everything together, set up EXE or XML, your downloaded bits, all that stuff. Go ahead and push it out whenever you want. And then if you want to change something later, like maybe you said, I want to do network updates. So I want to pull updates from a UNC path, just like you talked about. If you want to change that later and you say, you know what, I don't like doing this UNC thing anymore. I want to go back to pulling from the CDN. Maybe there's bandwidth things or you just want to go another way. There are GPO templates available for Office 2016 and the Pro Plus, and those templates override a lot of those settings as well. So if you're on domain joined machines and you have the ability to use group policy, highly recommend you manage a lot of that by going down that path as well. It's sitting there, it's ready to go. It's all out there. They are very different deployment models between the MSI and the Pro Plus version, or kind of these click to run versions. So MSI versus C to R, and really we're talking about customizing just C to R along the way. There is a really cool project. It's built by the Office dev team or some portion of them. So it's out in the Office Dev GitHub repo. Put a link to it in the show notes. It has an ODT generator, so it'll generate the most current version of the XML. It also has a very slick little tool, which is an Office downloader. And what it'll do is you can go ahead and generate your ODT and say, this is what I want to do. So I want to install Office. I want to exclude publisher and access from that installation. And now I want to download it and build a package. It'll actually go ahead, execute the download based on the configuration items that are sitting in your XML. And then you can choose to have that packaged up into an MSI as well. So if you want to do an MSI deployment of the click to run Office tool, because you want to push via SCCM or some kind of, or do a GPO based install, you can totally do that. All that stuff's sitting there and kind of waiting for you, ready to go.
Yeah, it gets really interesting. I've seen a lot of confusion too around the whole Office 2016, Office 365, especially from end users. I've talked to some people that they're not maybe super technical. They aren't in that IT space. And they're like, well, I have Office 2016. I don't have Office 365. And they get really confused because it's all called Office now. And if you're in that boat, you're kind of confused. Think of it as Office 365 Pro Plus, this desktop version of Office 365, isn't really any different than Office 2016 or even Office 2013.
You made a mistake there, right? So you did the same thing my users do. They come and they say, hey, I want to install Office 365. There's never, ever, ever anything to install with Office 365. Office 365 is a suite of cloud services and entitlements. Office 2016 is a desktop tool that you can have installed down to your desktop, right? I usually tend to harp a lot on let's keep the terminology straight. So Office 365, suite of cloud services, Office 2016, that desktop thing, or it's running around on my tablets or my Macs or things like that.
Right. And then the biggest difference there is the 2016 that you install as part of Office 365 uses that subscription-based licensing. It is the Pro Plus aspect of it isn't any special version of Office 2016 other than you have to license it using the subscription model, signing into your Office 365 tenant and license it that way. You don't have this concept of product keys anymore.
You got it.
You can still volume license it. You can still get volume licenses of Office 2016, use your product keys. Under the covers, it's going to be the exact same version of Office on the desktop as the one you would download from 365, just a little different licensing and installation method and update method.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, it's a fair statement.
Yeah. So under the covers, there's still some changes because they have to have under the cover changes for the different licensing. But yeah, hopefully that can clear up some confusion. But I think we're probably running really close to our 30 minutes now.
Yep, you're there.
So, all right. Well, let's wrap it up for now. We could probably do a more in-depth episode, longer episode, even on just the Pro Plus stuff. So we'll see. Let us know what you want to hear about. If you have any other topics you want us to cover, and we will talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Scott. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening.